Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you an episode review from the original Are You Afraid of the Dark show. Yeah, it's been a while. I used to have to overlay images on these reviews because it's very hard to get physical media releases of this show, and you can only get the first 5 seasons. So hence, if you looked at the thumbnail, I went online and I found me a bootleg Are You Afraid of the Dark complete series collection that features the first 5 seasons and the revival seasons that comprise season 6 and season 7. And I'm not going to post a link where specifically I got it from, but if you want to know exactly where, just reach out to me on Discord and I'll be happy to shoot you the link and you can potentially go buy this for your own collection. Now, because I got this warms my heart, so now I can review a lot more of this show. And pretty much all the episodes, I think minus 1 or 2, got book adaptations here. So this is pretty much an episode exclusive kind of franchise for the most part. So I decided to go into season 5. I picked a random episode to kind of try out the disc and see the quality. And this is really good stuff for a bootleg, I would say. But I picked a season 5 episode, and it's a divisive one in the fan base, it seems. And it's called The Tale of the Chameleons. I think this one was written by Mark Perry and directed by a person named Ian Patterson. I think that's their names. I could be getting that wrong. I'm not too familiar on the writers and the directors from this show, other than the ones that crossed over to Goosebumps, so forgive me if I got names wrong there. But this episode is most famous for the main character being played by 2 teenage superstars of the 90s, Tia and Tamara Mowry. They were the lead characters in the show Sister Sister. You might recognize them from Disney Channel original movies. They played the Twitches in those movies. And yeah, I knew this episode had some notoriety to it when I first watched it, maybe like 9 years ago. Back in the day, some YouTuber had like the whole show ripped on there, and I had a whole playlist, and I would just sit there and watch it. And I remember watching the episode back then and being like, oh, it's cool to see some more star power in this show, more so than we got in Goosebumps, it seemed. But revisiting it nowadays, I'm going to be honest, this episode's kind of whack. And I'll get into why near the end of the video, but I still strangely enjoy it. Does this get a recommend for me? Probably. And I only recommend it because if you can't tell, my name is Goosebumps Completionist. If you want to ask me which is a better show or what's my favorite, I'm going to tell you all day, every day, Goosebumps. Even if we're talking overall IPs, I still prefer Goosebumps over Are You Afraid of the Dark. But that does not shortchange my love for this show at the same time. With that being said, The Tale of the Chameleons, I think, is one of those handful of Are You Afraid of the Dark episodes that feel more in line with Goosebumps than it does with Are You Afraid of the Dark. And I think it's because of how the story's structured and how everything just unfolds. It feels like something that would be in the Goosebumps IP over the Are You Afraid of the Dark IP. So if you're into Goosebumps and maybe you're looking for a good segue episode to try Are You Afraid of the Dark, I don't know if this one will be the best one, but you can't hurt to start here or maybe throw this in as one of your first handful of episodes. So take that with a grain of salt, okay? Now, let's get into the plot overview of this episode without giving too much away. So if you're not familiar with Are You Afraid of the Dark, the Midnight Society always kicks off these episodes. It's not really important. I'm not really going to cover whose story this is, but the Midnight Society, they go into the woods at night, they bring some mystery dust, and they sit around a campfire, and whoever's turn it is to say the story throws it on and announces the story name. So the episode starts off like that, as usual, and it kicks on inside of this pet store. And inside the pet store, there's these 2 girls. One girl is named Janice, who is played by Tia and Tamara, who I guess share the role. And the other girl's name is Sharon, like I said, who is, I don't know who the actress is who plays her, but she's like Janice's best friend. And they're in there talking, observing some animals, kind of observing, the treatment of them. And they come across this little boy who's a redhead kid, very similar to how R.L. Stine would describe a character in his Goosebumps books. is looking inside of, you know, I forget what they're called, a terrarium with a giant lizard inside, right? And for anybody who's a casual, you know, science geek or animal lover can tell you that what's inside of this tank is an iguana, but they call it a chameleon anyway. So this was something you have to put at the door before going any further in the episode. But the little boy is just checking out this chameleon and saying, you know, it doesn't like to be caged up. And the girls are like, of course it doesn't. Look how cute it is. And Janice gets bitten on the finger by the chameleon. And the little boy cites a chant to Janice, you know, that's pretty much kind of like an omen in kind of like an old wise tale or old wise chant. And Janice is kind of freaked out and she knocks the cage over previously, and the chameleon had escaped. So she's kind of shaken up from the event, and she realizes that she has to go meet up with her mom, who's next door grocery shopping. So Janice and her friend Sharon go over to meet Janice's mom, but when Janice's mom tried to open the car door and set down the groceries, we see as the audience that this chameleon, I'm going to keep using quotation marks here, has crawled into the grocery bag and is going to be hitching a ride with them back to Janice's house. So at Janice's house, we meet Janice's parents, and they seem like, you know, typical nice parents. And Janice is kind of venting about, you know, her wanting to dye her hair and her wanting to get this certain dress and wanted to be treated like she's older. And her parents just aren't really having that with her. So Janice and Sharon decide to go up to her room and just mess around up there instead. Meanwhile, the parents discover that inside the grocery bag, something has eaten all the eggs and they have to throw them away. And they're like, well, that's weird. Why would the supermarket sell half-eaten eggs? That something's not right, but they don't really know what's going on. But we see as the audience that this chameleon has gone up to Janice's room and is spying on her and Sharon. And we can see that the chameleon is trying to bite her again because there's a chant that says, bite him once, bite him twice, you know, something with water, pay the price. That's the chant. So the chameleon's trying to bite Janice a second time and comes close, and you get some close calls, and you kind of understand that Janice doesn't really get along with her parents, and she's venting to Sharon while all this is going on under their nose with the chameleon. And Sharon ends up going home, and Janice goes to bed kind of upset. And she wakes up in the middle of the night being bitten in the stomach by this lizard thing, chameleon, right? And she turns on the light and she was looking around to see what it was, and she sees the long lizard and she tries to chase after it. But the lizard ends up changing pretty much into an identical clone of her and is trying to get her to touch some water. And Janice is like, no, I'm not doing that. You know, this legend has to be true. I'm not doing what you want. And it gets almost confrontational until Janice's parents gets awakened. And for some reason, this chameleon changes back to its original form and scurries off. And Janice goes back to bed. The next morning, she wakes up and her friend Sharon comes over. And Janice is like, hey, look, I had this rash. I got bitten a second time. I think this legend is true. And she doesn't know what to think of it. And Sharon is like, well, you know, why don't you get ready and I'll meet you downstairs. And Janice is in the bathroom thinking about brushing her teeth. And while this is all going on, the chameleon reappears as clone Janice and shoves her into a shower that she's kind of prepared for some reason. And real Janice gets turned into a chameleon. And now clone Janice is going to be pretty much the Janice we see for the rest of the story. So this is essentially how it plays out. Once this change happens, there's like a perspective change over to Sharon's point of view for the rest of the episode, pretty much. Sharon is downstairs waiting for her friend to come down. And when Janice comes downstairs, she notices that her behavior's off. You know, she's like apologizing to her parents about wanting to dye her hair and wear a dress and how silly that was. And Sharon's like, that's not like you. Like, what's going on? And we see some suspicious behavior with this clone. She's making phone calls and she's trying to arrange a delivery and you don't know what it is. And the next thing we know, there's a delivery to Janice's house, and the clone picks up a box and takes it up to her room. And Sharon has been over here the entire time and is curious to see what Janice is up to, and goes up to where she thinks she hid this box and is hiding something. And she opens up the box and sees a box full of chameleons that for some reason are in her closet. So she's kind of like shaken up by this, and she goes downstairs to try to make sense of it all. And meanwhile, we see the real Janice, who's been turned into a chameleon, trying to break through to Sharon that something's wrong with this person impersonating Janice, essentially. So there's a whole scene where I kid you not, the clone takes a meat cleaver and tries to whack Janice, and she even goes further and tries to throw her into the garbage disposal, right? And pretty much the clone reveals this big ultimate plan to Sharon, that the chameleons have been slowly taking over humanity for some time, and there's more of them now, so where they can do some serious damage or something. So she's basically got all these other chameleons from context to make an army, I guess, of Janice's family and her friends. That's to be implied, right? And we see this shot of like chameleon eyes, and this chameleon can willingly change back and forth between shapes. But Sharon rescues the real Janice, who's been turned into a chameleon, and decides to help her get close to this chameleon, because if Janice herself bites the chameleon clone twice, she gets to turn back into human form. That's how, I guess, how it works. So there's the climax ends up happening where they go outside, and somehow the box of chameleons ended up becoming a thing. I think Sharon or maybe clone Janice had gotten into him, and they're outside. And we see the pointing the finger, typical trope. You've seen this in Stay Out of the Basement of who's really who. You got real Janice, fake Janice, who do I pick? And you have Sharon holding a water hose because whoever gets squirted with water, I guess, gets turned back into the chameleon form. And let's just say Sharon picks one, right? And we think that the story's all over and done with. There's also something involved with this well in the backyard that might involve these chameleons as well. And there's a legitimate twist to this episode that Are You Afraid of the Dark really just never goes down into. And we figure out which Janice ends up, moving on, and what's down in the well currently. And then the story fades to black. Midnight Society wraps up the episode, and that's essentially the tale of the chameleons. Now, let's start off with positives for this episode, because I do have a few. The first glaring positive I have with this is that I totally see the heart of Goosebumps in the veins of this episode. I agree with a lot of people's takes on this. There's a few episodes, I've already brought up one. I've made a video talking about should have been in Goosebumps for this episode, and I've made a review on it. The Tale of the Vampire Town, right? Or Tale of Vampire Town. That one is pretty much textbook Goosebumps to the core. This one, with some tweaking, it could literally be Calling All Creeps. Just with lizards. Or maybe like a Tales to Give You Goosebumps short story. But still, this feels like something from the Goosebumps TV show. I would buy that if somebody put the Goosebumps intro on this, took out the Are You Afraid of the Dark font from the intro and replaced it with Goosebumps font. I believe it. Maybe not the cameras, because they're distinctly different than the Goosebumps show, but still, I mean, it's believable, right? So I think it gets that, lovable pass for me, because I see what I love in Goosebumps over Are You Afraid of the Dark in this episode, personally. I do think the acting in this episode is pretty good for this show's standards. I think Tia and Tamara definitely brought some good performances. Even the girl named Sharon, she was kind of the quiet, shy type and kind of reserved, but her actress was definitely fun in some areas. Maybe not the greatest actress ever, but still entertaining enough. And I really liked how, I don't know which twin played the clone Janice, but she gave a really tense performance, even for like a kid show standard. I mean, when she was holding the meat cleaver and whenever she made like grimacing faces, that was kind of creepy. I'm not gonna lie. I don't know if that creeped me out the first time I watched the episode, but watching it this time, I dug it. I really did. Some of the effects here, I mean, there are some kind of obvious bad effects, like when clone Janice is holding, real Janice in her chameleon form. It's a fake lizard. Let's just put it out there. It's obviously fake. But some of the CGI and computer effects in this episode look pretty good. I think they look better than some computer effects from like big budget movies from the early 90s, like Hocus Pocus, the Zachary Binks CGI. I remember that being kind of bad. This looks better than that. So, yeah, I mean, good effects. And for what the story was going for, it being a small-scale story, for the most part, it does have its issues. I do think that the twist really sells me on this episode and kind of saves it for me in a lot of ways, because it's dark, it's kind of sinister, and the implications are perfect to leave off on it, because you don't really need to go further of what happens, but you just know in your gut what's going to. And that's pretty well done, especially for Are You Afraid of the Dark standards. They don't do twists often in the show. I think somebody mentioned out of all the original 91 episodes, there was maybe a collective of 10 to 13, which is only like one season's worth of episodes, had genuine twist endings. And I heard that's like a big positive why people love Are You Afraid of the Dark over Goosebumps, is because Goosebumps is always throwing twists and you come to expect the twist. But Are You Afraid of the Dark, it's a fun change-up when you get it. And I can see that, all right? And I think that might be why it feels so much like Goosebumps, is because it goes for it. And I think the writer, he did a pretty fun job near that back half of the story. Now, in terms of my issues with it, I'm going to start off with the biggest obvious one I think most people have with it. The egregious passing, or the attempted pass, of them trying to use an iguana the whole episode, and a bunch of iguanas at that, and calling them chameleons. I mean, that's just really dumb. I have no words of why that was even a thing. It's just really redundant. I don't know if you can't train iguanas the same as chameleons, vice versa. Maybe it was an issue. I have no idea. It's probably in the Are You Afraid of the Dark TV companion somewhere. But yeah, that's just a glaring thing that really irritates me off the bat. The second thing about it is that while this is a short and sweet, to the point story, there's not a lot to this. This is one of the smallest scale stories I have found since like a story from Tales to Give You Goosebumps, where almost the whole story takes place in Janice's house. There's no setting change minus the beginning of the story and maybe the backyard and the ending. Everything else is just a very stale location. It makes it kind of boring. It's not very atmospheric. And because you have an iguana impersonating a chameleon, it's kind of annoying sometimes too. Because you're like, really? Do you really expect people to buy this? But besides that, the characters, Janice and Sharon, they're pretty much caricatures, like the typical Goosebumps book will try to throw at you. Every once in a while in Goosebumps, you'll get a developed character with good monologue, and you'll have good character growth and an actual arc. Here, there is none of that. It is just straight up Goosebumps caricature stuff. Janice is about as one note as you get with characters. Her whole thing is that she feels disconnected from her parents because they won't let her dye her hair the color that she wants and wears the dress that she wants. That's about it. And Sharon, she has arguably more character than Janice. And while she's not as good of an actress as T and Tamara were in their roles. I would have rather see a story where Sharon is just the main character the whole time. And like I said, this could have been reworked to pretty much be Calling All Creeps. But I would have rather see that than what we got here. Because to me, what the story is trying to tell you is a story about, it's a body swap, essentially. A whodunit, point the finger, who is it story. That's about as obvious as it can be. But what could have been done is that Sharon could have been the main character from the beginning. We see her seeing her friend Janice acting strange, and she can kind of catch us up to speed. Hey, look, she hasn't been the same for a while. I've been wondering why we've been so distant, and I realized at one point of this story, let's say in the first couple of minutes, she figures out that Janice got bitten by a chameleon, does some detective work, realizes that these chameleons have this plot to take over humanity, and now has to try to save her best friend and all these people that she knows that might be chameleons herself. And it could go into the who can you trust type of motif and make it more mind gamey. And yeah, they could have made pretty much a full book out of this. I think R.L. Stine could have made a book like that. For this show, though, it would have been a very condensed concept, but I think that would have been a better idea than what we got here. So yeah, very bland characters, very bland concept. Nothing new here whatsoever. So yeah, kind of boring. The second big negative is that the whole thing about how these chameleons can turn is kind of loose, but it's mostly followed. I think in the terms of the real chameleon, the saying is, if you bite a person twice, you get to assume their form. But when we see the chameleon assume human form, it can change back into a chameleon, and that's just fine, right? But when we see Janice get bit a second time, the next morning she has a rash on her stomach, implying that she's already turning into a chameleon. And I think that's what the story was actually saying out loud on screen too. What makes no sense to me is if Janice is turning into one, why can't she go in between chameleon forms after the second bite? One, and two, why does the water thing even matter? Is the water thing like a temporary lock? I think that's how it's treated. But none of this stuff ever goes beyond the legend aspect. And I think where the unnecessary convolution comes in is specifically with the Janice getting bit the second time and developing a rash. You don't need that. I mean, like, why do you have another alternative if this is the solution? It kind of reminds me of the Haunted Mask 2 book, where one solution is you need a symbol of love to take the mask off. But in Haunted Mask 2, they throw a random monkey wrench at you as a second option to take the mask off, which is finding its suit, right? It's one of those scenarios that just feels kind of cheap. And also, like I said, it's unnecessary to have it in there. I mean, if the whole point is to get her wet and morph, then why do you need to include the rash? Unnecessary body horror. And I have never really said that on camera, but this is really unnecessary. And you'll see what I'm talking about. It just comes off random because it doesn't really get expounded on whatsoever. And that leads into my third issue. My third main issue with this episode is this story. Like I said, it's a typical body swap story. They're pointing the finger, trying to figure out who it is in the end. That's all this is. But at some point, near the end of the episode, you hear this diabolical plot about this chameleon clone buying up all these other chameleons or asking them to be delivered. So apparently, and we don't really know why, but you can imply why. She wants to use these chameleons to take over Janice's family and her friends, right? That's to be implied. And she reveals that the chameleons have been slowly taking over for some time. Okay. All right, cool story, right? Why does that matter? Why does this matter? Because it leaves so much questions, right? You're like, okay, well, why aren't we going into the big picture of the story? Why are we staying so small scale? Why are we just focusing on Sharon trying to rescue her friend Janice, right? This is not like a Calling All Creeps where you build up to a point where Ricky has to make a choice to go with the popular or go against them, right? And the implications are way grander in that story because there's actual stakes in the big picture of it all. There is no stakes with this, so why is it in the story? And to make matters worse, what I can't wrap my head around in this episode, honestly, and this is the one thing I've been struggling with ever since I've watched it this past time for review purposes, is Janice, the real Janice, right? When she becomes human, right? When she becomes human in the climax, and she's trying to say, hey, I'm not a chameleon, hey, this is the real me. She does pretty much everything. To be fair, it's very in the moment. It's kind of chaotic. The chameleon comes up with an idea that may or may not work out in their favor. But all Janice had to do, if she had the rash from before, and this is consistent, pull up your stomach. There was setup and payoff where there's a scene where you see the real Janice's stomach has a rash. And the new Janice, the clone Janice, clears up her rash by showing it to Sharon later on. Clear sign, setup and payoff was not used. It just seems kind of, like why have these low dangling fruits in the episode if you're not going to capitalize it in the writing? That stuff just kind of frustrates me on a fundamental basis. On a fundamental basis, that's just really lazy. So, with all that being said, Tale of the Chameleons, I still liked it enough, right? I was kind of in the middle on it for a little bit in my memory, but after rewatching it, I do think that those positives do counterbalance some of these negatives I have. And I decided that I at least thought it was worthy of a 3.5 or higher, which is at least a C. But I thought against putting it above a 4 because I'm like, this is not something that's pushing me loving it or anything. It's just good for what it is and fine for the most part. So that's where I was at. It's just fine. And what I usually rate fines as is around that 3.5 to 3.7, pushing average good. And all those adjectives still apply to this. But I decided to collectively deduct 1.4 off the top from 5 and give this about a 3.6 out of 5, which is a C minus for me. But that still is a good grade. I think I'm being more than fair on this. I do think that people are very, very harsh on this episode for, understandable, but also heavy-fisted reasons. I just think that, for what it is, it's actually pretty decent. It's better than a lot of the weaker Goosebumps stories, I would say, at least in terms with its ideas. It doesn't go too far out there, but it does have its laziness and its problems, its visual problems too, and its character issues. But with all that being said, that's my thoughts on the Tale of the Chameleons. Let me know down in the comment section if you've seen this episode before. Do you love this or do you hate this? I'm dying to know, and I'll see you next time.